Alright you guys, this episode of Paradigm Profiles is going to be something a little bit different. This next episode is going to be a tribute about a friend of mine that just recently passed away. It's a tribute to his memory, who he was, how he lived his life, and how he lost it. It's titled A Soldier's Tribute. The sun was beaming. It was a hot, humid summer day, and I was getting ready to run one of my infamous burpee routines. A routine some of the homies used to hate me for. When I say hate, I say it with humor. Because the homies had major love for me, and they ultimately knew I had good intentions. But when it came to doing hundreds and hundreds of burpees and inspiring them to get out there and do it in the scorching hot sun, a lot of them needed that extra motivation. Back in those days, I was a young, striving NR member. I was in my mid-20s and I took my position as one of the exercise coordinators serious. I took a lot of pride in the fact that I was up front leading the charge, and I wanted the homeboys to see this. The 6-yard back in those days was packed out. The Africanos that were out there with us were also deep. Our numbers back then were by far the deepest than we had ever been. There were times when we had to run 2 machinas because there was just too many of us out there. Those years were like no other years throughout the entire history of the Norteño movement, throughout the entire span of all the time I had spent behind the walls. Simply put, we were at our strongest. The Nuestra Raza's ranks proliferated and the Nuestra Familia converged on the streets of Northern California with a vengeance. During those years in the 90s, when I would continuously pass through San Quentin on parole violations, I had the opportunity to meet a lot of good homeboys. Homeboys from all over, from Salinas, San Jose, Oakland, Santa Rosa, Vallejo, Pittsburgh, Decoto, San Francisco, Newark, Soledad, Watsonville, Castroville, Greenfield, and other places from all over. A lot of these homeboys that I met would eventually fade off over time as a distant memory, while others would leave some type of memorable impression on me. One of these homeboys in particular was a guy by the name of Mousey from Morgan Hill. He was a short, stocky, bald-headed little guy with a thick whip and a positive attitude. One of the things that stood out to me about Mousey after I got to know him is how much he reminded me of my mentor, the late Mike MC Castillo from Salinas. Not only did he kind of resemble him, being a short, stout, bald-headed, stocky little guy with a thick whip, but he also bore similar characteristics as well. Like MC, Mousey was a mellow, laid-back kind of guy who was soft-spoken, well-educated, and he just left an impression on me that not too many others were able to do. Unfortunately, the last time I would get to run into Mousey would be in San Quentin on the legendary and infamous 6-yard. The 6-yard was located behind East Block with the death row yards. It was a place that will forever be seared into my memory. Not just because of all the legendary guys that I would run into back there, but more so because of how we functioned back in those days and because of all the energy that resonated off of that yard. The energy was crazy. It was different. The morale was peaking and carnalismo was a real thing back then. A lot of homeboys were really striving because they were true believers and they were proud to represent the movement. Everything about the way we functioned was exhilarating and the energy was off the hook. Before we fell into formation to do the yard machina, we marched and recited a cadence that could be heard throughout the entire prison. It was a part of history that I'm still proud to say that I was a part of. Mousie was a few years older than me, but we were both going through the NR indoctrination process together. Almost immediately we hit it off and bonded out there. He grew on me, and although I wouldn't see him or run into him over the years, whenever I'd run into homeboys from Morgan Hill or other homeboys who were there with us in San Quentin, I'd always ask about him. He was just one of those kind of guys you would meet and always wondered what path in life he took, what direction in life he took, whether or not he was still on the team, and if he was even still alive. The lifestyle we chose is a rough one. Tomorrow is never guaranteed, but this is even more so true living the kind of life that we chose. You hear about homeboys dying all the time. Some die at the hands of others, some die because of addiction and choices they make, while others are taken in the streets prematurely. It's now been close to 30 years since I was out there on the yard with Mousey. Since we were out there programming, doing burpees, and taking part in history that we were both fortunate enough to be a part of. A lot has obviously happened since that 30 years has passed us by. His life took him in a bunch of different directions and forced him to deal with some difficult hardships. Ultimately, Mousey would end up developing some serious health problems due to complications from previous stab wounds, which ultimately led to him spending the last month of his life on hospice. Sadly, on 6/11/2023, Mousey lost the battle he was fighting and tragically succumbed to his illness while he was surrounded by family and loved ones. Staying true to his beliefs and the way he lived his life, he went out on his terms and embraced the last days of his life fighting like the soldier he was. I'll try to put it in perspective for you guys so you can kind of understand the path he walked, as well as the tumultuous type of lifestyle he lived. Mousey's birth name was Lermy von Lerma. He was born in Azusa, California in 1958. At the age of 10, his family sought better employment opportunities and decided to relocate to Northern California. Ultimately, they settled down in Morgan Hill, a small, quaint, eccentric town which lies between the foothills about 25 miles south of San Jose. At the early age of 10, Mousey was already getting in trouble and would eventually end up in the local juvenile hall. Like most of us who got involved in mischief at a young age, he started hanging around with other troubled, like-minded kids, which eventually led to him being placed in juvenile hall. It was while he was there in custody that he would meet a couple of guys who would inevitably have an enormous impact on his young life. At the time, Mousey couldn't have possibly have known the type of impact these guys would eventually have on his future, nor could he have known that these guys would also become some of the most loyal and closest friends he would ever have. The names of these guys were Robert Brown Bob Viramontes and Jeremiah Tanto Ruiz. There was a couple others who would later play integral roles in Mousey's life, but Brown Bob and Tanto were the two standouts who would later have the biggest impact. At the time, with Mousey still being 10, he obviously wasn't associated with any street gangs yet, but Brown Bob and all the others were all claiming a local street gang called Barrio Morgan Hill Lomas. Mousey would later get jumped in and become a member of this street gang, making his official christening into the gang world. Over the course of the next few years, Mousey would continue to slip deeper and deeper into the criminal element. His family tried to do everything within their means to save him and avoid losing him to the streets, but the more they tried to help, the more he gravitated to the streets. Like most youngsters who end up glorifying that lifestyle, Mousey was captivated by the flashy cars, the women, the respect, the money, and the prestige of the lifestyle. As he continued to run around with Brown Bob, Tanto, and others, Mousey found himself caught up in the reoccurring cycle of going in and out of juvenile hall. This continued throughout his teenage years until he turned 18. As soon as he turned 18, Mousey was already headed for prison. He learned the hard way that the adult criminal justice system didn't give the same type of latitude to its customers as the juvenile justice system did theirs. After catching a couple of cases, they fast-tracked him to prison and handed Mousey his first prison bid. Barely 18, Mousey coincidentally adjusted to prison and the environment behind the walls well. When he got there, he was lucky enough to have had the opportunity to be around some older, very seasoned NF members. In fact, one of these guys just so happened to be his brother-in-law, who wishes to remain anonymous. For the purpose of telling this story, I'll just call him Chino. Chino was a well-respected, well-known NF member who was also from Morgan Hill. He had been in and out of prison most of his life, and Chino was considered to be one of the NF's true stalwart believers. As soon as Mousey arrived, Chino didn't waste no time. He started indoctrinating Mousey on the fundamentals of the NF history, the policies, security, weaponry, and the basic politics that Mousey needed to be taught. When they were on the yard, whether they were walking the track or posted up at one of the tables drinking cup after cup of coffee, Chino continued teaching Mousey the NF history, the origins of the cause, what the struggle was founded on, and the purpose of the NF's objectives. As Chino fed this knowledge to Mousey and continued to indoctrinate him, he assured Mousey that someday he would pull him when the time was right. For now, he told Mousey that he wanted him to spend every idle minute of every hour of every day absorbing and soaking up as much knowledge as he possibly could. Sometime around 1983, while he was doing time, Mousey was approached by his old friend, Bob Viramontes, who at that time was being called Brown Bob. Brown Bob was no longer the young kid Mousey remembered who was from their neighborhood, Barrio Morgan Hill Lomas. He was older, he had a thick whip, He was a lot taller and he carried himself with an air of respect that told Mousey that Brown Bob had become somebody. He didn't know the full extent of it yet, but Mousey was real observant and he clearly seen how the other NF members treated Brown Bob. They treated him like a leader and the respect they were showing was intriguing. At one point, Brown Bob told Mousey that he wanted to speak to him about something important and that this was going to be a day that Mousey would always reflect back on. As Brown Bob went on to explain the NR objectives, the 14 bonds, the formation and goals of the NR plight, the history and origins, and why the NR was being created, he said something to Mousey that caught him completely off guard. Mousey was shocked and needed to be sure he was understanding Brown Bob right and that he wasn't misinterpreting anything he had just said. To be sure, Mousey probed deeper and asked questions so that there was no misconceptions about what it was that Brown Bob had just explained to him. Brown Bob told Mousey that if Mousey chose to be a part of the NR, that he would be a part of history for the cause, but more importantly, one of the very first of the NR soldados to be recruited. Brown Bob also told Mousey that if he agreed, he was also going to be elevated as one of his insulators, that he'd be delegated as one of his right-hand guys, and that this would be a selective position. It was at that time Mousey accepted Brown Bob's proposition and became one of the very first original NR members recruited. This was an honor and a momentous undertaking as the NR was just being introduced into the prison system. Guys like Mousey who demonstrated intellectual stature were being placed in leadership positions and the movement was set in motion. Once Mousey was released in early 1985, he was paroled to Morgan Hill and he immediately hooked up with another original NR member who was also one of the first to be recruited. This individual was Mateo from Greenfield, who also happened to be another brother-in-law of Mousey's. These two had a common goal: to establish a connection between Morgan Hill and Salinas. This was for the sole purpose of breaking NF ground, where they could not only operate and do work for the NF, but also build up the NR by pulling some of the best soldados. And this is exactly what they did. They recruited hitters, homeboys who had a strong propensity for committing acts of violence, and those who had no qualms when it came to spilling blood. Over the next 6 months, Mousey and Mateo would accomplish their goals by establishing one of the first street regiments. However, both of them would inevitably be picked up for parole violations. It was during this time, while back in on a parole violation, that a change of events would ensue that would ultimately lead to dire consequences for Mousey. While Mousey was in on this parole violation, an incident occurred while he was being transported from one prison to another, where he almost lost his life. During a layover, Mousey was getting processed in R&R with the BGF member, Black Guerrilla Family, and as a part of the intake process, they were told to take a shower. Once they were in the showers, Mousey would later say that he felt like something about this setup wasn't right, and that he began to sense that he might have been in imminent danger. His sixth sense basically kicked in. Almost instantaneously, at the precise moment that he felt like something was wrong, he noticed 3 other individuals who were also in the shower with them. 2 were Raza, and the other one was a Wood. All 3 of them were cuffed to handles that were affixed to the shower walls. The 2 COs who had escorted Mousey and the BGF member to the showers apparently told them that the other 3 guys weren't supposed to be in there, and that they would be right back to get them. At that point, they walked off, which seemed real suspect. Mousey said that all he remembers after that is hearing the BGF member yelling that they're coming at you, brother. These guys apparently slipped their cuffs and had this all planned out. It was at that point that Mousey realized that all 3 of these guys had bone crushers and that they were focused on him. All he remembered after that is that the BGF member had broken away and was trying to help get these guys off him. In the fray, the BGF member was able to take possession of one of the bone crushers and he used it to fight these guys back. He was able to keep them pushed back enough to keep them off of Mousey until the 2 COs came back. It was later determined that Mousey had sustained a total of 20 stab wounds. Some of the wounds were nearly fatal, and although Mousey survived the stabbing, he spent over a month recovering in the hospital. It was also later determined that this hit was ordered by the ME, and that the 2 officers that escorted Mousey and the BGF member into the showers were also in on it. These types of hits were more prevalent back in the 1980s and 1990s. It was common to walk into a setup like this, and a lot of the COs were heavy sympathizers. They either sympathized for the ME or they sympathized for the NF. Mousey continued to elevate his status within the movement, and at one point, there was even speculation about the possibility of Mousey being a sleeper. This was never substantiated, but the rumors continued to circulate nonetheless. Unfortunately, Mousey's close friend, Brown Bob, was killed in Campbell, California in 1999. By this time, Brown Bob had elevated to one of the top leadership positions within the NF and had firmly established his legacy as a stand-up type of Familiano. But like so many others before him, Brown Bob became a victim of nefarious politics and internal political jostling. Sadly for him, he had also become aware of the fact that there was a lot more to life than that small dark corner of the world that he had confined himself to for so many years. In short order, the blinders came off, as they often do at one point in most Familiano's careers. He got married, had kids, became religiously invested, and spent his days appreciating some of the luxuries in life that he allowed himself to enjoy. That's what he was guilty of, and for this, he would pay the ultimate sacrifice. One day, while he was out in front of his house, an Explorer pulled up with a 3-man hit squad in it. Their figurehead, parked down the street, was parked at a vantage point that allowed him to watch the events as they unfolded. By the time Brown Bob figured out what was going on, it was too late. He was assassinated in his driveway in front of his wife. His killers pumped bullets into his arms, chest, legs, and back as he attempted to retreat into his garage. This murder accomplished nothing for the NF in the big scheme of things. It only resulted in 4 other NF and NR members catching life sentences, and a 5th who was also assassinated for failing to wipe down the getaway vehicle. It was later said that this hit was meant to serve as a warning to the entire organization, that no one, even those at the highest positions within the mob, are not exempt from consequences for breaking NF law. But this message was lost and overshadowed by the fact that most of the organization felt like this was a bad call. So this was another dark spot in the NF's history, and even the message that it was supposed to convey was distorted. Over the years, Mousey would spend his life caught up in the prison revolving door, going in and out of prison. He could never find a way to break the chains, and just became content with the type of life he was living. But like so many other NF and NR members who spend the majority of their lives trapped in addiction and running the streets, Mousey was no different. He spent years and years destroying his body by using intravenous drugs, and this is what would ultimately catch up with him. As Mousey aged and got up into his 60s, his body began to shut down and show serious signs of long-term drug use. At one point, one of his arms had gotten so infected with abscesses that the doctors actually considered amputating his arm. At another point, a family member who was close to Mousey recalled one time when he had asked her to cook him breakfast, like he had done many other times before. Only this time, when Mousey came into the living room, she noticed that the color of his complexion had taken on a drastic yellowish color. It's believed that this was attributed to liver and kidney damage caused by intravenous drug use. But the end finally came in June of 2023. Unbeknownst to Mousey, his pancreas had erupted, and as a result, the poisonous fluid had slowly managed to spread throughout his body. From that point on, he just continued to get sicker and sicker. On June 1st, 2023, Mousey's body had taken on so much damage that he was eventually confined to hospice. When the doctors put someone on hospice, you know the time is near. It's at that point that they're basically saying that there's nothing else that they can do, and that conventional medicine can't do nothing more to help. They tell family to just take you home and to try to keep you as comfortable as they possibly can. Mousey was a warrior, and he fought as long as he could. But now cancer had also become part of the equation. It had spread throughout his liver, stomach, and kidneys. There was mention of chemo and other medication that might have gave Mousey a few more weeks to live, but at that point, Mousey was at peace with his state of circumstances and elected to go out on his terms. Like a soldier, he knew the fight was over and that there was no use in prolonging the inevitable. He knew it was time to say goodbye to this existence and to embrace whatever came next. On June 1st, 2023, he decided to stop taking all his medication. He was rapidly deteriorating at this point, and even the subtle communications he had been giving had drastically slowed down. He also decided he would no longer eat or drink water. Several days in, he stopped communicating altogether. He was still alive and he continued to breathe, but he was just barely hanging on. Without sustenance, his family knew he couldn't last too much longer. He spent his last days surrounded by family who watched him gradually and slowly fade away. In the beginning, Mousey would open his eyes or squeeze someone's hand as a way to acknowledge that he had heard something that they had said. But as the days passed, he stopped opening his eyes and there was no more hand squeezing, no more movement. Mousey lasted 11 days without eating or drinking water. It was painful for family to watch him become reduced to what he had become due to the amount of weight he lost, but they supported him and stayed with him until he took his last breath. On June 11, 2023, Mousey Lerma passed away peacefully among his family and friends. He went out on his terms and he fought like a soldier. Mousey was 65 years old when he went to his final resting place. There's a lot of homeboys who knew Mousey, and I'm sure most or all would agree that he was the type of homeboy who left a good impression on everyone who met him. He had his issues and he struggled with things just like the rest of us do. Nobody's perfect, but this brother was loved by many and respected by all those who knew him. Rest in peace, brother. There's no doubt in my mind that you're in a better place. To his family and all those who were closest to him, on behalf of Paradigm Media News, we extend our condolences and hope that most of the pain and grief that you've had to endure has finally subsided.